Hi, I'm Linda Fanaras, host of B2B Brand 180 podcast and CEO of Millennium Agency. Today, we are going to talk about branding and marketing strategy. But before I start, I'd love each and every one of you to hit like, share, or subscribe to just help our channel grow. Today, I'm excited to bring in Kana LiVolsi from Mundos Creative. And what I love about Kana is that she's an advocate for empowerment of minorities and female in business. She has a background in entertainment media, working in production for companies like NBC, HBO, Showtime, and BBC, and the list goes on. And what she really understands is brand and creative strategies across the consumer markets. So, welcome. I'm excited to have you here today on the B2B Brand 180 podcast. So, thanks for joining in.
Thank you for having me, Linda.
Yeah, so let's just get started with just a quick introduction about you and your company, and then we'll start to ask some key questions around consumer marketing. Sure.
My background is I've had basically three careers now. So I was in film and television, and then was a pioneer in the digital publishing industry and started our agency about 8 years ago. And we work with everything from Fortune 50 to disruptive startup brands. Our focus is we're a brand consultancy and creative studio, and we focus on the full brand CX ecosystem. So world building and kind of end to end storytelling, making sure that consumers and brands are resonating in an authentic way.
That's awesome. So the market, as you know, continues to get more and more cluttered. There's more mediums out there for companies, B2B companies to take advantage of, and it gets, frankly, more confusing than ever. But how would
Mhm.
you define an actual strong brand in today's marketplace? And what do you think are the key components that can contribute to a business's success?
So for us, it always comes back down to the consumer. And consumers, in my mind, can vary from your traditional consumer that is buying your product through a retailer, or it can be thinking about your customer as your potential investors, your potential partners, thinking about who your target audience is and making sure that you're really understanding their needs rather than just talking at them.
And I think that happens a lot with marketers when they're putting together some of these strategies and storyboarding concepts and selling propositions. I think one of the things that we find, and I'm sure you find it as well, is brand consistency. And what happens with companies and marketers within the companies, they get tired of the actual brand that they've devised in the market. Can you talk a little bit about elaborating on the importance of brand consistency across the various platforms and channels and how companies may want to ensure this consistency?
Sure. So I think the easiest way to go about it is talking about how what your brand really is trust with your consumer. And the only way to really get trust, even in your one-to-one relationships, is by showing up consistently. Think about with your partner, with your friends. If you don't show up, if you act out of character in a way that they don't expect, and in a negative way, or something that goes against your what they see as your moral pillars, then you are not being consistent. The same thing goes with brand. If it's the most important thing you can have is the consistency. So being consistent with consumers is the most important thing you can do, because if you're not consistent, if on one platform, so let's say in your social media platform, you say you're an advocate for women, and your C-suite executives show up and do something that contradicts that, people start to question your authenticity. They start to question what your company really stands for. And so consistency is the most important thing for a brand.
Yeah. And I see, you see a lot of this, not so much with obviously with the larger brands where they're very consistent with their brand strategy and their brand image, but sometimes on the small to mid-sized companies, as I had mentioned earlier, is they will devise a brand strategy. And as time goes on, they start to slightly alter that. And before you know it, they have the original brand out there, and then they have an alternative version of that, or a multitude of different versions out there. And so before you know it, if you're looking at this company from different mediums, whether it's on the digital or on the billboard side, you may not be able to connect the dots. And that's the power of maintaining a very strong brand identity. So I also think that's a key component to keep in mind. I'm sure you see it a lot as well.
Absolutely. And to that point, a reason why that happens is also siloing within a company. I actually have seen it a lot at large companies because their teams are so siloed and they're acting so independently that they're not communicating as well. And their internal communications are not as strong as they need to be. So their employees are losing context for what they're doing.
Yeah. And I think brand loyalty becomes more and more important today because the market is becoming cluttered. There are a lot of niche products and services out there that are coming in from a different angle. And there's strategies and tactics that businesses can take advantage of that help build the brand strategy that helps resonate with the target audiences and fosters a strong brand loyalty. Are there certain recommendations you can make to our audience on how to foster a really strong brand loyalty following?
So this actually goes directly back into why we created the report. And the part of the issue with brand loyalty is that consumers today are smart and they don't feel that brands really understand them and feel like they've become very attuned to brands. Women control 85% of consumer spending, right? Well, 91% of women also feel that brands don't understand them, which is crazy if you think about it being over half the population feel like they're not understood by brands, which shows you that brands aren't doing their homework. And so it's very hard to build loyalty with a consumer base that feels like they're not being understood.
Point.
And so it all comes down to the conversation and understanding your consumers. So the best way to build loyalty is to actually go back to looking at how your pillars line up with what your consumers are looking for and the messaging that your consumers want.
And how do you go about actually assessing that communication strategy or that messaging strategy? And I'm sure there's some common pitfalls, which you just talked about. Are there
Mhm.
other pitfalls to avoid?
Absolutely. So we talk about in the report a two-prong approach. There is so much revenue being left on the table right now because one, consumers aren't being understood. And two, there aren't enough of these marginalized consumers actually in decision-making power at a company. So if you don't have a woman in the room and you're trying to sell a female product, if you don't have women from the Black communities, Asian communities, Latino communities, from the LGBTQIA communities,
Right.
you don't really understand what they're looking for. You understand what stereotypes of them tell you they want. It's really looking at it from the perspective of, do you have enough decision makers in the room who feel empowered to talk, or do you feel like those decision makers feel like their voices are being muted in the corporate setting? And on the other end, it's a matter of, are you doing your consumer research in your actual areas? Or are you just making assumptions about your customer base?
Right.
And that's why companies bring experts like your company and my company in, is
Right.
to look at who the consumer base is and help them understand better how to talk to them, who aren't sitting in the same bathwater every day.
Right. Exactly.
Right?
Like, and I think that's an important piece because I do think that companies think that they know what their messaging and positioning and story should be. But when it comes down to actually surveying that data, they find out that maybe they might not be accurate and it might be something else. So I think it's important to do some quantitative and qualitative market research in order to determine what is the best strategy that's going to resonate and maintain brand loyalty with our customer base, and how can we tie that into our overall marketing and communication strategy. So it totally makes sense.
And in that situation, you're actually building a future proof brand, right? Brand marketers like yourself and and I know that a brand is more than a logo. And when you're looking at your consumer data, when you're looking at your pillars, when you're looking at your messaging strategy, you're looking at how you're going to continue to evolve and resonate with your customer.
It's a constant thing.
Exactly.
What do you say
Exactly.
when it comes to leveraging social media and other online platforms? Do you have any recommendations on how brands can effectively leverage these mediums in order to engage with their audience in a really meaningful way? Because I know a lot of companies use social media in different ways. Some just boast their company, others share things that are happening within their company. Do you have any thoughts around that as far as strategies are concerned?
There's a lot of different ways to go about it. And obviously, it's different for each company. But typically, it really comes down to posting content that is useful for your consumer. And also meet your company goals. So if your company is fairly corporate and feels a little stiff, it's social media is a great way to show up and show a little bit of personality, to be featuring the individuals at your company and a little bit more of your mission and why they are there, why they're a part of your team, what your company is trying to do that maybe doesn't come across in every marketing effort. So little profiles within it, showing some behind the scenes in your stories. We'll talk about Instagram for the moment. But TikTok is another fantastic place to do very similar content. And then also featuring and talking to your real customers. We actually have a client that's built a platform that is all about peer to peer marketing. And what it does is it measures what your consumers are saying about you on TikTok versus how your internal content is showing, how it's resonating with your consumers. And so by using tools like this, it's called Self for anybody who wants to look it up. But by using tools like this, you can actually go in and see what your consumers are saying about you and start to get more brand data, more brand insights to understand what consumers really want to hear about your company, as well as what they're saying about consumer or about your competitors, so that you can really start to hone in on what resonates with your consumer base.
So before we go to our next question, I just want to take a moment and thank the audience today for listening in. If you have a moment, if you could like, share, or subscribe to our B2B Brand 180 podcast, that would be fantastic. So getting on to our next question, I want to talk a little bit about storytelling and how it actually shapes a brand's identity, and maybe some best practices for our audience on how to integrate that storytelling into actually a brand's marketing and communication strategy.
So at the end of the day, everything we're talking about here is storytelling. When you're looking at what the most valuable asset your company has, it is how you tell your story, because the angle of it, the slant, dictates how you're perceived. Every piece of information out there is a combination of psychology and data, and it informs emotions. And so, what you want to be looking at with every piece of content you put out there, every positioning that you have around your company, whether it's on your social media, your executive profiles, your PR, your partnerships, everything should have an emotional core. It doesn't mean you have to be trying to tell like hallmarky, very like intense, sappy stories. It's just knowing that there is a meaning and a purpose behind your brand beyond buy my stuff,
Right,
right?
exactly. And that brings me to my next question, which is, this is always a popular question, is how do brands actually differentiate themselves from a competitor? Because I think what happens is they may do some competitive research and find out that their competitor positions their way in a certain way. And for them to define how they're different can sometimes be challenging. Are there some
Right.
innovative approaches that can help them sort of capture that consumer attention?
With anything, our company specifically has a very product marketing slant to it. What we do is we do a full SWOT analysis. We do full persona build outs. We have a couple proprietary partnerships with technology companies that actually get geographic data around your consumers, what they're seeing, what they're wanting, both in store, online, and then other tools like the one I just mentioned for their social media. So by getting a good understanding of what your customers are wanting and how they're acting, you're
Mhm.
able to see differentiators in the market that you may not have fully understood were there. And then by looking at your team, looking at your weaknesses, opportunities, threats with SWOT analysis and your personas, you're able to determine if there are creative approaches that you could be taking.
What are some key considerations that businesses should keep in mind when they're expanding their brand into international markets and they're adapting that brand strategy to resonate with a diverse culture, preferences, and values?
So we deal with global clientele. And again, that's also why we're so passionate about looking at marginalized audiences. Because if you go into any market and assume that you know what those people want without actually asking them, without actually diving into the culture, without actually learning the differences between how it operates here versus in that market, you are going to fail. You have to understand the nuance of perhaps certain words that you're using even might be offensive in other cultures. You have to know your consumer very deeply and understand them, understand what they want, and not just be focused on selling. And I feel like I'm repeating kind of the same thing with every answer just because
That's
that's the
key.
core of what most companies are missing right now. Even though everybody knows that's what you need, most companies are failing to actually do it if you look at the data.
And I think that it's really important to get that consumer feedback when you're sort of shaping like a brand's future, particularly either in international and domestic markets. I don't think it really matters, but like really finding methods of gathering, analyzing the right information so you can and make informed strategic decisions.
Absolutely. Creative without data is just art, right?
It is. No, and that's a great way to put it because I think a lot of companies focus in on they think versus what the consumer base thinks. And it's important to figure out what the consumer base actually thinks. So I didn't know if you wanted
Absolutely.
to add anything else for our audience that might help them through the branding and communication strategy process today.
So, really, what it comes down to is making sure that you're employing system thinking and design thinking into every process. Going in and looking at making sure that you have an exploratory process before starting every new project, not just using old data, because the consumers are rapidly evolving, as we know, especially since the pandemic and we had digital transformation just go crazy.
Exactly.
Right? So making sure that you're really looking at your data, making sure that you're reevaluating your customer personas, looking at your pain points and how they tie to your overarching strategy to see where things are falling out. Because typically we find that if there is a failing in an ecosystem, it's because it is a brand is failing somewhere within their brand CX or brand customer experience. So how they're communicating, what they're saying, the imagery they're using, something is actually not authentic to what the brand should be saying to their consumers based on the research and the data.
Yeah, that's
So
great.
just continuing to harp in on that.
That's fantastic. Thank you. Well, I'd love for you to share how businesses can get in touch with you.
Well, to get in touch with us, you can go to our website at dosmundoscreative.com. It's two worlds in Spanish. Or you can reach out to me on LinkedIn at my name, which is probably going to be a lot easier for you to type in looking at my name on the bottom of the screen than me to spell it all out. But feel free to reach out and happy to stay in touch. And if you go to the website, you can find the report to
Oh,
learn more about it.
that's great. So thank you for tuning into our B2B Brand 180 podcast today. We hope you found some great insights and strategies by our guests. Again, I'm Linda Fanaras, host of the B2B Brand 180 and CEO of Millennium Agency. And feel free to visit us at mill.agency or definitely connect with me on LinkedIn. And just to help our channel grow and educate more B2B leaders on brand strategy, feel free to like, share, or subscribe. And thank you again for listening. Until next time, happy marketing.